Okay, this is going to be a two-part video to kind of introduce players who come from AD&D and maybe 5th edition D&D. They're thinking about switching over to Pathfinder Second Edition, or for new people who've never played the game ever before, want to get a little background where it comes from, how it's changed over the years. So this video is going to be in two parts. The first 12 or so slides are going to give you an overview about the two different games, the game systems, where they came from, some of their strengths and weaknesses, some of the resources you might want to get your hands on if you are interested in coming to play. From that information, you'd be able to decide to yourself, like, hey, that sounds really cool. I want to get into it. And then the second part will show you step by step, like how would you make your first character, what kind of phone apps you can use, website resources, all that kind of stuff. And then a walkthrough of the actual details of creating a character, because it is probably one of the most robust character creation systems of any tabletop role-playing game released, even more so than D&D 5th edition. All right, let's go ahead and get started here. This is going to be, like I said before, a little bit of background. You know, D&D came out when I was a little kid in 1974. It was this 3 little booklets that were like staple bound. They're about the same size as the classic Traveler books. They actually came out before Traveler. And then in 1977, they had released this boxed set of the game, which had an 8.5 by 11 little blue monochrome, Arial Helvetica font rulebook, and that was the first real role-playing game ever. So if you've ever played an MMO, or you played a pen and paper role-playing game or a board game with role-playing game elements to it, there was no such thing as this until 1977. It's actually the birth of these kinds of things. And at the same year is when Classic Traveler came out, which was a science fiction version of the same kind of game, where you create a character, you're rolling dice to figure out what happens. You've got someone that's kind of moderating the game, acting as a referee or dungeon master or game master. And that whole social kind of relationship of, going on some great adventure or invading another country or getting big massive combat fights or flying a starship and all that kind of stuff happens in your imagination. And over the years, people have added things like miniatures and models. They play over the internet now. You can use things with high resolution graphics, all kinds of really cool things. So in 77, where it's all kicked off, so if you ever want to go really, really retro, you can actually get old copies of these original books and read them. They're very fun to read, and you can actually still play these games. There's nothing wrong. In fact, I have a massive video series just dedicated to AD&D, which stands for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. In 1977-78 is when the success of the game, the popularity was huge, that they created hardbound books, almost like textbooks you'd have in school. They made 3 of them. The first one was a monster manual released first. That gave everyone playing with the basic set a huge, massive list of enemies to fight. These enemies to date are still classics. The first hill giant, fire giant, titan, harpy, lamia, drow elf, all those types of things you read about in books, that you've seen in movies. They've all been kind of brought together, influences from sword and sorcery fantasy novels, the Lord of the Rings. You don't really have titans. You have red dragons, sure. You have dragons like Smaug and the Hobbit and things like that, but you didn't have, ancient mythology creatures brought into a game. No one had harpies. That's in like Jason of the Argonauts. But in addition to all that stuff, they added all these devils and demons and sub races and goblins, gnolls, hobgoblins, orcs, all these classic things. They were all kind of assembled, and that was the beginning. And the funny thing about that is that they have stood the test of time. How many times have you seen a game, or Magic the Gathering game, or a movie that's got an orc in it, right? This is where they came from. They were originally written in a Tolkien book, and they became part of this role-playing game, genre. I mean, every single OGL game made today has orcs and gnolls and elves and dwarves and halflings and stuff like that in it. So going back in time, you can get the original AD&D PDF versions. They're very cheap on Drive-Thru RPG. You can buy actual hard copies, but they're considered a collector item in the modern day. They did do a reprint in 2012 where Wizards of the Coast took the original books, not pictured here, and reformatted them, cleaned them up, fixed typos, and reprinted them. They were hugely popular and sold out immediately. They have a bronze cover. If you look for the 2012 reprints of the Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, and I forgot to mention the Dungeon Master's Guide. Those are really great. You can probably more likely get a copy of those as a hardback than you would the original ones. There's no difference. If you get the reprint, it's the same thing as when you're reading a novel. It's a reprint that's been reprinted 100 times. So about 10 to 15 years later, in 1989, there have been a lot of content created for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. We started playing this game as kids in middle school, played it through high school, played it after, in college, and around 1989, where a lot of us are getting out of college or getting our first set of degrees and things like that, they released the second edition. So this was happening in my early to mid 20s as a young guy and a young designer, and this version of the game really blossomed from the amount of quality content that was created. A lot of the systems were refined down. More detailed rules were put into the game, but it wasn't as excessively complicated. You ever heard the phrase THACO, which stands for to hit armor class 0? Like, all kinds of elements were added in second edition that really made the first edition, or AD&D, play really well. If you were a hobbyist and you would love the original game, you knew pretty soon that the Dungeon Master sometimes had to make a lot of things up. Like, here's for example, let's say you're playing through a dungeon and you've got a wizard and a magic user in your party. No, they're not called wizards, they're called magic users, and they find a book written in a drow language, right, with sketches and maps and diagrams all in it. They would have to cast a certain spell to read it. Where later on you might be able to do things like a DM would say, well, you know what, I'm going to let this elf make maybe an intelligence check and make up a rule on the spot, where maybe they roll a d20 or they roll 4d6 to their intelligence score, or lower or higher, to see if they can kind of decipher it, because there was no recall knowledge or lore skill like you have in Pathfinder. So there were technical by the book ways to do things in AD&D, but it didn't have a lot of player character empowerment. You'd run up, you would attack or cast a spell, and that would be it. There was a lot of problems with the first idea of a melee round. Melee rounds were 1 full minute long, and they were divided up into 10 segments that were 6 seconds long. So you have a big, massive combat and had all this implied warfare going on back and forth and back and forth. The movement rates were kind of odd. So there's a lot of little baby mechanics that were kind of goofy, but the idea was so strong and so brilliant that the people overlooked those things, and those elements became refined over the years. Second edition really refined a lot of the core elements of the game, and for another 11 years, it was pretty much the king. I mean, there was no real competitor. There were other, role-playing games came out because role-playing games were popular across the board. But AD&D became a stronger franchise. I believe it was during this time frame when Hasbro / Wizards of the Coast purchased TSR, and TSR went defunct, and they stopped doing stuff for Greyhawk and just focused on the Forgotten Realms and took it from there. So in 2000, which is just 21 years ago now, a massive shift happened in the game. It went from being a tabletop role-playing game to being now owned by a company that was also doing Magic the Gathering, that's also making board games. And they went back with a brand new kind of crew of designers, not the original designers. They had all been moved on and on doing their own things, to create the third edition. Now, the third edition has really stood the test of time of the last 20 years from some of its core mechanics, which is as characters gain level, they're getting more hit points. As they gain level, their armor class numbers are going up. As they're getting levels, they're able to, they get much more bigger bonuses to hit things. It's not as heavily reliant upon a magic sword anymore. For example, in AD&D, if you had a +5 sword, that was like the most amazing thing possible. It's almost an artifact. Where in 3.5, if you're level 12, you have a tremendous base attack bonus that way surpasses that. So everything scaled big, big, big. Numbers got bigger. Characters run around with 140 hit points and things like this. You would never see that in AD&D. You might be lucky to see a level 10 magic user with maybe 30 hit points. So another big shift in the third edition was the inclusion of a tremendous number of checks based on what's called a difficulty class system. And 5th edition uses this, 4th edition uses this, Pathfinder uses this basic idea that if you want to do something, there is a target number. It's called a difficulty class. And you roll a d20, and you got to roll higher than that target number, and you have all kinds of bonuses related to your character or your skills or the things you specialized in or your class. And that's generally how you determine a lot of major player actions in the game, unless they're specific. For example, 3rd edition was the first one to add this hide, spot, move silently kind of check relationship. They just got away from the hide and shadows, move silently number that was in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and made it where there's a counter to that, like a spot check. So, for example, if you're playing a rogue and you're hiding in the shadows beneath some barely torchlit hallway and you're moving very stealthily, you need to make sure you can meet a hide check. So you're having to check against a score number that you have for your skill, which gets bigger and bigger and bigger as you get more levels. And then someone else, an enemy, might make a spot check to see if they can detect you. So you have a lot more contested roles between the player action and what's happening in the world or what's happening with the monsters, which makes a lot of sense. But it did bog things down a lot. 3.0 was really well known for the release of the Open Game License, or OGL. If you're just getting into gaming in the last 10 years or so, you probably have heard about the OGL. You don't know what it is. It doesn't mean old gangsters or anything. It is the Open Game License. So they released the game as an Open Game License, an attached one, which allowed anyone to take the core game system, distilled down into what's called the System Reference Document, or the SRD, and make any permutation of a game they wanted to and commercially sell it. So if you were around then, and you can still do this today actually, you could have taken the base ability scores of strength, dexterity, intelligence, wisdom, constitution, a charisma, and you could have made a space game or a game that's very historically accurate, set with conquistadors versus the Aztecs, or you can make a Wild West game, or anything you can come up with. Any movie, film, sword and sorcery, make up your own characters, keep the basic attack rolls, keep the basic armor classes, make your own enemies, write it up, format it, publish it, print it, distribute it, become a book publisher, right? Make a game publisher, make a card game, do whatever you want to do. The OGL in the beginning used to have limitations for saying you couldn't make a video game. Now, over the years, that seems to have kind of slid to the wayside. It may have been revised. But in the beginning, they didn't want people making video games. So that was okay, but people could make books. This actually helped the game grow. And let's go to this. We go to the next era, from the year 2000 to 2003. That Open Game License, so many people suddenly started digging into the mechanics of the game, realizing some things were clunky and cumbersome, and some things were really strong. They started changing the game around with subtle changes here, like house ruling things. And with the Open Game License, suddenly there was hundreds of thousands of supporting materials being sold to support D&D. People were making, vampire supplements and mythology spell books and all these kinds of things, anything they could think of. They weren't doing other people's licenses. They were just coming up with themes. They were putting gunfighting in the game and doing a modern D20 version of the game. And the game started being called D20 because all the mechanics revolved around rolling a D20 up against a target number, which is either armor class or a DC or difficulty class. So the problem was with this, in essence, in my opinion, is that if you were really into your game and you were really looking for a slight variant, like you wanted to play D&D in the Wild West and you didn't want to dig out a copy of Boot Hill, you could do that. Or if you wanted your adventurers to go, if you wanted to create your own, starfaring game, or you wanted to play Star Wars, there was a D20 version of Star Wars, etc. A lot of game publishing companies jumped on this bandwagon and created their own games. Monty Cook Games was based on this kind of stuff. So 2003 was when 3.5 came out. So since 3.5 has pretty much been the mechanical foundation of the Open Game License that Pathfinder is using, with tremendous changes and modifications over the years. Because in 2007, I remember vividly, I was working in Europe at Crytek at the time, they released the 4th edition. The 4th edition had come out right around the time of an anniversary of like a 40-year anniversary, I think it was, or maybe it's a 30-year anniversary. I can't remember the number now. 4th edition was a huge sweeping change, the first of which was the removal of the Open Game License. Now suddenly you couldn't make your own stuff anymore. It was against the law. Only a select few people were given an actual license agreement, which could have been something they had to pay for. Like you could go to them and say, "Hi, I'm Manticore Dungeon Games Company, and I want to make D&D player handbooks and modules." They may say, "No, we don't want you to make them because we don't think your quality bar is good enough." So in 2007, they kind of removed the ability for anyone to make anything in the Open Game License going forward. But the existing Open Game License was you could not be reversed. You couldn't take it away. So it was very interesting because now you have this split happening. You have a game that is being reimagined. It has very action-oriented MMO combat mechanics. If you had been playing World of Warcraft since 2005, you knew exactly how to play 4th edition. It had a lot of really interesting improvements. It had a great library of books and publications. It was good. There was nothing wrong with it at all. It had some funny namings, like controller and things like that. And so some of the class names were kind of different. Some people felt it was a disaster. The thing about it that was strong is it wasn't just more of the same. They added daily powers and encounter powers and all these kinds of things. And the game Neverwinter, which is a free-to-play MMO by Cryptic, now published by Perfect World Entertainment, you can download it and play it tonight, even though it's kind of rewrapped and repackaged to sound and read like 5th edition, and it really is an MMO video game which doesn't have the exact same game system. But when it first came out, it was a 4th edition game. It wasn't Neverwinter Nights, which is based on 3.5. It was a 4th edition game. It used all the abilities and the class names and all that kind of stuff from 4th edition. 4th edition is really good, actually. It's an interesting. It's like that old rock album that you hated when it came out, but then when you get older, you think it's awesome. So it's really, really cool from that perspective. It has great art in it. I can't speak more highly of it. I just think it got kind of a bad take because of the open game license. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not a historian. Paizo was with a partnership with Wizards of the Coast to publish things for them. There was also a push to make this GleeMax internet connectivity for D&D. They were going to make this database where you could have all your characters and you could have all the books. And they didn't quite have a virtual tabletop. At one point, they were pushing a 3-dimensional battle board. It wasn't really ready for prime time yet. And I remember all this because I was very excited about it. But we were working on the CryEngine. We were like, wow, why don't they use a game engine to do this? And we were like, couldn't figure out why they were doing that. The way I understand it is the folks who were doing the Dragon magazine, which was Paizo, that group, they kind of iced out. So they found themselves saying, well, you know what, we're going to use the open game license and do our own thing, which is completely legitimate because they were very good at writing and designing things and making content for people, and people liked their work. So this is a good thing. I think this split that happened between Wizards of the Coast and Paizo has been fantastic for the game. And the thing about it, I think, is probably the most magical is you now have a really good, solid variant of a classic game that doesn't really play that different, but has a very different tone and moment-to-moment feel to it. It sometimes appeals to different people. If you love D&D 3.0 or 3.5, the first iteration of Pathfinder was in essence that version taken to 11. With gobs and gobs of content, a brand new world that no one had ever seen before, an incredible amount of character options, all kinds of adventure paths. I mean, they really established themselves as a powerhouse developer, from my perspective, because the amount of content they created was just was absurd. They must have made 5 or 6 bestiaries, which are like monster manuals. The amount of publishing and content that they did, pretty much in my mind, won the day. I think the amount of content was happening in the D&D front in the 4th edition was beautiful and well crafted and was at a decent frequency, but it couldn't keep up with what Paizo was doing. And Paizo was keeping that flame alive. If you were there in 2000 and 2003, in 2009, less than 6 years later, you still got a great game to play that's constantly being added and supported with flip maps and all kinds of stuff. Another point I forgot to mention was, in the modern world, we kind of take for granted how there's miniatures everywhere. Around 2003, 2007 is when miniatures really kind of crossed over into this resin method that they use now, where all the companies make so many of these inexpensive miniatures. They used to be lead. Years ago, like Ralpartha and Grenadier, they were lead, and they were kind of goofy looking. They weren't as high resolution, they weren't as chiseled and detailed. So really detailed miniatures also modified the rules. Now you have game tables where, 1 inch square is 5 feet, and all the rules are talking about things in increments of 5 feet. If you go back to the original AD&D, things are they did this weird unit of measurement called, inches, which is like a double hash mark. Like if you look at a set of architectural plans, it'll say, the width of your driveway is 17 feet, which is 1 hash mark, 17 hash dash 0, an inch mark. So they would use like 12 inches for the standard movement rate, which really meant 120 feet, and an inch in the game was multiplied by 10. So it was a really bizarre unit of measurement. Once miniatures kind of became popular, or making your own tokens, The game became more tactically controlled on a battlefield. So things like rules for line of sight, who's in front of somebody, you're picking a specific target you're attacking. You have multiple types of ways of attacking after 4th edition came out. And in the abilities that you had in the core rulebook for Pathfinder had a lot of feats and abilities you could do as well. So player action in combat became much more tactical. You had a lot more options of things you could try to do, things you wanted to do. You had different ways to do damage. The enemies did as well. So now it became kind of a war game to some degree, but it was still a role-playing game. So at its heart, with the popularity of Warhammer and Warhammer 40K, probably the king of tabletop wargaming, you now got role-playing games market that are becoming this incredible hobby that spans between all kinds of stuff. I mean, spanning from collecting miniatures to collecting cards, crossovers of Magic the Gathering, anything and everything. So all this hobby has just exploded. So in 2014, they released, Wizards of the Coast released the 5th edition. They kind of returned back to the roots of the original game, almost taking a blend between a little bit of 3.5, a little bit of the themes from AD&D, and they repackaged the whole thing with a much more streamlined kind of basic edition feel. They removed some of the verbiage and the names and the themes that was in 4th edition, and they switched back to using the old words that they used to use. They still kept some of the same basic core systems, and if you've played 5th edition, you know this already, right? And if you're coming here, you never played 5th edition, it's the most popular version of the game ever, right? Because it's opened the door for all kinds of new ways to play and new popularity. For example, no one was streaming D&D in 2007. With the advent of YouTube and Twitch being so much more accessible, and Facebook and other social media, you have BAFTA award-winning voice actors and celebrities playing D&D. Once the word got out about that, and then you have Geek and Sundry, and now you have web streaming, and you have people, role-playing, doing voices at the table. It's no longer about tactical movements and miniatures and trying to hit someone from a certain distance away and moving just out of range. It becomes more about theater of the mind. So there's kind of two camps with the way the games are played these days. There's the more tactical players who are treating it almost like a PvP battle or a PvE raid instance, and WoW. They're trying to play with maximum success, working as a team, healing their party members, not interested in how they look or appear. They're trying to defeat incredible enemies and great adversaries to advance a story, right? Or advance an adventure. And then you also have a camp that's playing from a perspective of it's fun to get together and role play a character for the purposes of using your imagination and being kind of extroverted. But that's okay. There's two different kind of ways of people playing. Some people use a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Like I played games. Last year we did a Pathfinder game where we had a little bit of voice acting, not a lot, a little bit kind of turned on, turned off. Some of us aren't good at it. We kind of dropped it over a while because we're not making a stream to entertain other people. We're just playing for fun. So I think those are the interesting distinction because both games, both 5th edition and Pathfinder, have those kind of camps. You'll find some people who are like Knights of Everflame, a Pathfinder show they put together 2 seasons of it. I mean, it has a blend between mechanics for 10 seconds and then a character's role playing for 10 seconds and back to mechanics. So they kind of shift in and out of it. And Critical Role made this hugely popular. So that stuff's still there. But after COVID, virtual tabletop playing has really exploded, which is fantastic because both of these games are very well supported on Roll20. They're very well, which is expensive, unfortunately. They're very well supported on Fantasy Grounds and, of course, Foundry Virtual Tabletop, which is my favorite of the 3. So that's kind of the world history of that. When you talk about the games themselves, you're like, okay, say you only played D&D a long time ago, you never played 5th edition, and you heard a lot about Pathfinder Second Edition. It's been out for 2 years now, coming this August. I think it's like August the 9th or something. You kind of want to know, what's the difference between the two? Well, it isn't really like Toyota versus Nissan thing. What happens is, I have a Victory motorcycle. I love Victory motorcycles. But every time you ride a motorcycle somewhere and someone at a gas station who's never ridden a bike in their life, they go, hey, man, that's a cool Harley. They think Harley is a motorcycle, right? It's like Coca-Cola is a soda. And no one says that, hey, can I have a Ritz Cola? They say, hey, can I have a Coke? They don't ever say Pepsi, right? So D&D is kind of like that. It's someone says they want a beer, they'll call it out by name. But if someone says they want a juice or something, they'll say Kool-Aid, right? So D&D is kind of the Toyota of games. It's the most popular one. It has the hugest legacy. It's 47 years of content, and it's been regurgitated and rewritten and repackaged a lot, which is I can understand why, but it has, and there's been some new creative things added to it, but it certainly has tried to pay respect to its own heritage. It's never given up on it. And so if you want to go back and get into D&D again, and you miss playing when you're a little kid, fifth edition is perfect for that. Especially if you're trying to do something that you played a long time ago. Like if you remember playing the Hall of the Fire Giant King. I mean, look at the cover of the player's handbook. That is Snur, the king, the Hall of the Fire Giant King himself. Now, I don't remember anyone flying through the air in the last fighting scene, but if you know what I'm saying, the themes are there. They're huge, robust hardbacks, and extremely popular with old school players and a new generation of younger gamers who are all in it for different reasons. Fifth edition is a great ease of play. They have multiple worlds they kind of support, so that makes it a little tricky. Eberron was a big thing in 3.5. You've got Forgotten Realms, pretty much is the big one, but there's multiple worlds to play, and of course, everyone can make their own worlds. So fifth edition is strong. It's good. I don't have any negatives to say about it at all. It just doesn't, for me personally, have the character empowerment that I think that Pathfinder does. So Pathfinder does some things I think are different that I like much better. The one thing I really like about Pathfinder is, since I was there when AD&D came out and D&D come out, the Temple of Elemental Evil, I played that 40 years ago. I don't want to keep replaying it in every edition of the game over and over and over again and have someone change the rooms and then change the enemies and change the story, but keep using the same name. You know, it's like, if you want a Corvette, it's a Corvette. You don't want to get into a Corvette and find out that it has a hatchback on the back of it and it also has a luggage rack. So, you know, sometimes there's elements to some of the older stuff that has just been kind of messed with. Okay, it's still there, but it's kind of like they're using the name, and they're using some of the elements, but it's really changed. It's not against. There's no Clavdra anymore. You're not going against the Drow. So, what they did in Pathfinder is their entire world and universe is completely original. So the Inner Sea is the major primary area that people play in, and you can get maps of that online. Just type in the Inner Sea region for Pathfinder. It's been used in the first edition, which lived for 10 years and still going today. They're still supporting the first edition. And 10 years later, of all the history they developed in that one, is their same Inner Sea world that they're using now. They have a huge globe and a huge world, but the primary gameplay takes place in this massive area that very much similar to Europe and Africa. So their universe is original. The other thing they do, which is really interesting, is that over the years, they've always created iconic characters. So they have named characters that are iconic. Mauricio the Rogue and Valeros the Fighter and Kira or Kyra, however you say her name, this cleric with a scimitar in her hand. And so you have all these different, Hrusk, you have all these iconic characters. There's an iconic swashbuckler, a iconic gunslinger. Over the years, as they've added more classes to the game, they've always associated those characters with a signature Wayne Reynolds art piece. And all the other artists have had to kind of replicate that art style. So every time you see a Pathfinder book, Pathfinder artwork, like the backgrounds I'm using here in this presentation, it's about those characters. You very rarely see a piece of signature art that has a bunch of randoms in it. So because of that identity with the iconic characters, that means you have a great point of reference when you go into the process of trying to create your own character, because you're going to see how these other characters are created. Even when they're doing a write-up that tells you like how the game is played, they're talking about that ensemble cast of characters. So the depth of the universe is great. The iconic characters is wonderful. The player character options is overwhelmingly good. Most times when things are overwhelming, it's like organic chemistry. It's not that fun, right? But the amount of character options you can do, the amount of actions your character can do, from feats, from all the different types of basic actions you can do in the game, period, it just means you're at the table. You may have a tough time deciding what to do. You're so used to playing a game where it's like, I attack, or I cast a spell, or I heal, or I throw a potion on the ground, or I open a door. And you're playing Pathfinder Second Edition. You're like, okay, wow, I have a lot of things I could do. The person on my team just did this. What would be the coolest thing I could do to help them, or change the tide of the battle versus my enemies? The enemies have tremendous number of things that they can do. They're not just swinging wildly at you the whole time. They'll have special abilities. They have traits. They have special powers you've never seen before. So because of that, you have this endless matrix of us versus them with so many options that it feels almost like you're playing an MMO with 400 character classes. It's just crazy to a certain degree. But the good thing is there's no bad options. So when you're creating a character, unlike making an MMO character, you can spec into something really bad. You can make any character you make, they're all going to be good. All the abilities and the things you have are going to be good. That makes the choices even harder. The second thing is the insane book volume. The game's been out 2 years, and they've already released like maybe 8 or 9 major hardbacks to build up the lore of the Inner Sea region. They've released an advanced player guide. They've released the Gods Myth books, and I'll talk about those later on. But their book volume and the consistency of the writing is astounding. For a small publisher of probably like 40 employees and a few contractors, the amount of hyper focus they have is really impressive. When you see a 5th edition D&D book coming out, sometimes it has maps drawn by one person and sometimes it maps by somebody else, and a different author over here you've never heard of, but a great consistent packaging. Like the production value is really good for the cover art and everything. But when you get inside of it, the consistency may not be there, which is tricky to do because they're a lot of times leveraging and lifting their own heritage to, like Strahd, right? Like the Strahd stuff, Ravenloft. That came out a long time ago, right? It's been redone like 4 times. So they're going to kind of cherry pick this and keep that. And people love it because they love the whole vampire theme, right? But it's been reworked a lot. It's like a greatest hits album where they keep changing the guitar solo. So in Pathfinder Second Edition, it's crunchier, which can be a negative. The thing about the crunch that a lot of people have problems with is there are so many particular rules for certain types of situations. You don't have to use all those rules, right? Most people seem to forget that. I see so many people ask questions. They want to know the exact way to do one particular action. And a lot of times those actions aren't going to come up that often. And the GM may need to rule something. But it does have that crunch in there. If you want to get into a game that has not a NASA level, but a chemistry class level of rules and things that will handle any situation, they certainly have worked out the rules and they're very well balanced. I cannot found any major holes at all. And even all the stuff I've been reading from all the other players who are even more complicated and more frequent players than I am, there haven't been any major holes. There have been 1 or 2 little things that people think are relatively powerful, but nothing that kills anything. The big thing I think is a real strength of this game is how lethal it is. When you play a D&D game, it's not that big of a deal. You're pretty heroic. You're almost a demigod. In Pathfinder Second Edition, you're pretty heroic too, and you have a lot of abilities you can do, but if you choose the wrong one at the wrong time, you can find yourself in real trouble. And the enemies are not fodder. The enemies, if they're controlled properly by a game master, they have a lot of lethal, nasty things they can do. They're almost like a Warhammer hero on the battlefield. They're going to wipe you out if you're not very good. And the balance is very tight. So the relationship between the hit numbers, the damage output, the armor class numbers for you as a party of 4, most things are balanced around a party of 4 versus a series of enemies of a certain challenge rating. Very, very tight, very close. So it's not as much, unless your GM just really throws it out the window and overdoes it. People can play one of the very first introductory adventures and be wiped out by a pack of wolves, which is almost embarrassing, right? You're like, wait a minute, you spend 2 hours rolling your character and you got killed by wolves in the first encounter in the Fall of Plaguestone. So it's a kind of an eye opener for people who aren't used to thinking about what they're doing. So I like that. Some people don't. Some people just want to blumber around and go, I'm just going to attack this guy here. And that doesn't really fly. If you do that because of its 3-action economy, you will find yourself dead real quick. I like that. I think that's great. It's not cheating, though. It's not the kind of game like Half-Life 1 where you're going to get shot in the head at 400 feet away with a revolver. What it is instead is the enemies are powerful. They have things they can do. That you're fighting against a human AI that has a lot of weapons at their disposal, and you have a lot of weapons and abilities at your disposal. So where you position, you have a tremendous amount of mobility. Where you go, what you do, it's going to make a big difference. So another element I'll sum up with on this section here is that all the lore, all the character designs, the enemy designs, the locations, the history, the adventure paths, everything else they made in the first edition, you're talking about 10 years of that is all applicable to second edition. The numbers are different. That's the only thing that's really changed. So if you like Rise of the Rune Lords, you can use the same map and use the same enemies. You just need to convert some of the enemies into second edition and you're ready to go. So your old content's still valuable. I'm a firm believer that old content from previous versions of games is always usable if you just have the GM change the enemies. Most other things don't really need to change at all. So story should stay forever, but the details behind the scenes and nuts and bolts and numbers can stay the same. So let's go. Let's try to speed things up here. Let's go to the next section here. Now, if you really wanted to get into the game, there's three interesting ways to do this as an approach. One of them is to, you can get a copy of the core rulebook. Its price has dropped tremendously since 2019. If you get it from Paizo, it's pretty expensive. It's like $59. If you can get it in print form from like Miniature Mart or somewhere, or even Amazon for $22, you can get a used copy of it much cheaper than that. There was even a humble bundle earlier this year to get a PDF version. If you get the official PDF with a watermark PDF from Paizo, it's only $14.99. That's really useful too. Nothing beats having a book and a PDF, to tell you the truth. So getting that book is very useful. It's over 600 pages. It's really, really detailed. Every sentence has meaning to it. Every rule is well explained. Over the last 2 years, a lot of people have been kind of it's hard to have a book with so many interrelated rules conveniently presented in the right order based upon what you're trying to do. So when you're creating your first character and you're making a cleric and you start thinking about what deity you're going to use, you're going to flip to page 400 or something and then flip back. And so you're going to have a lot of flipping around, but it's broken up into easy to use chapters. And since the dawn of time, that's how books are. They're broken up into chapters. So just get over it and you'll be fine. The index is well done. So another element to this game that you may not realize is because it was based on the OGL, the Archives of Nethys, which is a website, has everything ever released for free and freely accessible as a database to search through on the website. So say someone says that they've got a particular feat that their friends, you say you've got a friend who's like playing, I don't know, let's think of something real quick here. Let's say you've got a friend who's got Scout's Warning, right, which is a thief feat for level 4. And you don't understand what triggers it, and what does it actually do, or a 6th level feat for a thief called Gang Up. And you're like, you heard it, you read about it on Facebook, you don't know what precise debilitations means. You can go to Archives of Nethys and type that in, and if any enemy has it, what page, what book, you can look all that stuff up. So when you're learning, that website, not pictured here, is very, very useful. Everyone still uses it. It's fantastic because you just can't memorize everything in the entire game. So that's really good too. I've mentioned this in other videos, and I think it's always really useful. If you have an Android device, Path Builder 2E app is free. There's a picture of it here in the front where it says new character, low character. That is so invaluable. It has all the books released in it, which comes from Archives of Nethys, the complete database. You can build a character step by step by using this app and export it to PDF and send it to yourself as an email. It's incredible. I can't believe that Paizo never made a website that does this. It covers all the books, including the ones you don't even own. And this is an interesting thing because every time they release a book, they're adding more ancestries, more options, classes, things you can do, heritages. They're adding things to the game for more options to make more different types of characters, different regions of the world, different styles. So what happens is this app is very frequently updated with all that. So if you don't have the advanced player's guide and you want to play a witch, you can roll that character up quite well in the app, and it'll explain to you what all the abilities do and everything. It's amazing. It's probably the coolest thing that's ever happened to RPGs, in my opinion, is having an app you can have on your phone that allows you to explore and build a character and export it to a PDF. Without having to do the old school method of filling out 4 pages of paperwork. The character sheets in Pathfinder Second Edition can look like an IRS form if you're not careful. But when you're learning, using this app is very helpful. Hopefully one day it'll come to Apple devices. I know a lot of people use Apple, and they're very miffed that they can't have this. But it's not my problem. I wish it was on Apple devices so everyone can use it. Maybe one day he'll support it over. It's probably because he wants to do it in Android. So the Wanderers Guild website has popped up in this past year, and it's pretty useful, but it's just not really done yet. It's its flow is pretty darn good. It's nicely organized. You can put character abilities together. You can see this kind of below here. It has like a little blue unicorn logo. It's worth checking out. The exporting's not really ready for prime time yet. It's coming soon. But if you want to have a digital website bookmark for a character in a database, this is really, really nice. It has everything you need to do. It calculates things for you. You put a piece of gear on, it updates the AC. So even if you're playing a game session and your shield breaks, You know, instead of having a character sheet you printed out or a PDF that you can't change, you have the character sheet here in a web page. You can just like update it right there on the spot, and it'll update the character. So, you know, say you're using something and you lost your flail or you sail it, and you want like this, you got some material components you add to your pack. You get into a wineskin, you got a strange glowing crystal star. You want to put it in your inventory. If you're not playing a virtual tabletop game and you're playing in person, you got a little computer or laptop with you. You can have your character kind of live updated right this in front of you, which is really useful. A lot of people like to play sitting around on sofas and stuff and theater of the mind, and having a little laptop is a cool way to keep track of your character and let the DM roll the dice and all that kind of stuff for you. So the Wanderers Guild website's really good. When you're first trying to learn how to make a character, which will be our second part of our video coming up later on, the combination of all three, the book, PDF, printed, the app, and this Wanderers Guild website, that's fantastic. So basically the barrier to entry to get into the game is about $15. So everything else is free. Everything else that you talked about is completely free. You don't need to have some kind of account somewhere that's owned by the publisher to have all your characters stored. So that's really useful. Now, earlier you heard me mention all those books, right? So they do have a lot of great books, and they can be expensive. You can get them in PDF form, and even some of the PDFs are expensive. But the upper left-hand corner is the core rulebook. So this is really the one you want to get. If you want access to all the classes and you love books, I would suggest getting the Advanced Player's Guide Second, which is the one to the right here that has these characters on a boat and a little sailboat being attacked. They're dead, right? That one has 4 new character classes added to it, new heritages and ancestries, which are basically like character races in AD&D. They just call them ancestries now, which is fine. So the game also has the Game Master Guide. I actually found the Game Master Guide to not be as useful as like the classic Dungeon Master's Guide. I actually never opened it at all. But when it first came out, I read a lot of it. And I was like, wow, this is going to be useful one day maybe. And so I just kind of set it aside. A very hardcore GM will probably love that book. But for me, it's not as useful. If you're going to learn how to play the game, you're just going to be a player, you don't really need that book at all. You don't need it at all. I didn't put any pictures in the adventure path section, but you know, Paizo has always done this. They're constantly releasing these serialized adventure paths with a cool name, you know, like Extinction Curse or whatever. And these things are really well done. They're very thick. They take forever to finish. They often have new abilities, new feats, new ancestry, new heritage, things that you can build a new character in a brand new way, a different race you can play, different weapons. It's just, wow, it's almost like a collect them all book publishing deal, isn't it? So the fact that they have added so much content buried away in the adventure paths is good and bad. It's good because the game constantly keeps growing and these adventure paths open up new fun ways to play. It's bad because, you know, it costs money. Now, if you remember a few minutes ago, I mentioned about the app and the Archives of Nethys. Because this is an OGL, open game license game, all the information that they ever release in any of the books, and if you don't own it, is going to be in the Archives of Nethys and going to appear in Path Builder. So you wanted to make a witch, which appears in the Advanced Player's Guide. You don't have the copy of that book, and maybe you're short on cash and can't buy even the PDF. You can still build a witch character in the Advanced Player's Guide by using the app. So that's really, really useful. So remember that. Don't let the books get in the way of you playing the game, because remember, it's only like a $15 barrier to entry. On the right-hand side here, we got 4 really cool books. The Melange Expanse just came out last week. It's really, really strong. They're all oriented around this inner sea region of the world, which you see this map to the right-hand side, which you can tell pretty much right away. It feels like the Mediterranean with this being Europe, and then you're down here kind of like Africa, and this is Middle East. That's okay. I mean, if you look at the world of Hyboria from the Conan's franchise, and Elric and Lord of the Rings, a lot of these game worlds are always like sea is on the left and the continents are on the right, right? Even the Forgotten Realms is that way. It's very European feeling. But even so, this is a universe that they've been developing and building all their adventures and their stories and their history in for the last 12 years. So they have a number of books for Pathfinder Second Edition that carry on the legacy that they established in the first edition with even more production value, more details, such as this Lost Omens World Guide that tells you all about the different regions and all the different things you can do there. So if you're a Dungeon Master / Game Master and you want to know about the world and maybe make your own unique adventure set in their setting, that tells you everything you need to know. If you're going to play an adventure path, they're pretty much self-contained, but having all the ancillary information and the lore is always great if you're a huge fan of their universe, right? They also made this character guide, which has a ton of really useful information for people going to play a character in that game world. They have a Gods of Magic book they released, which is really strong as well. And then the Melange Expanse came out recently. It completely covers this entire intercontinental area here, which is almost like Africa, from a coastal line all the way into the dark jungles in the middle, if you want to call it that. So that book is really, really good. Very, very impressive. Over 19 some odd authors worked on that book. It's really strong. So they do have a lot of books. This is what they do for a living. They publish high quality role-playing game books with magnificent concept art in it, really good writing, fantastic editing. You probably can't beat it. It's probably the best in the world, if you ask me. I really don't see anything that anyone can hold a candle to. Let's go into some details here about the game system itself, the snapshot of it. And this is pretty, I try to summarize this into one page as best I can. But Pathfinder Second Edition is an evolution of 3.5, so you still have strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Those ability scores have only changed order, but they've always been the same. When you make a character in Pathfinder, you're starting ability scores with what's called ability boost along the way. You start with 10, and you start boosting them in increments of 2 as you make choices about building the character, like picking your heritage or picking where you came from or making your class choice. All those things are going to modify your ability scores, or in some cases maybe drop it down based on a flaw. That's very different. It still uses ability modifiers, and ability modifiers, like, if you have 18 wisdom, you're going to have a bonus to things related to wisdom as opposed to having 16 wisdom. So that's still there. That's a carryover from third edition. D20 rolls to beat a target number is still there, like you heard me say earlier. The DC or difficulty class is still there. You have increasing armor class and hit numbers as part of your progression. That's always going to be there because you're going to get proficiency bonus, which includes your level. It's going to increase over time. You might be getting weaponry with bonuses to it. So enemies have incredible abilities and fixed hit points, so you don't have hit dice anymore. So if you ever played any AD&D or old school D&D, how many times did you see a listing of 3 hill giants guard this area, hit points 37, 42, 46. So they all have different hit points, right? Which back in those days was kind of scary because you would be fighting something and you wouldn't know how much health it would have. Now in Pathfinder, these things have a fixed health number pretty much. So you can memorize a hill giant and know that they're going to have X amount of health, just like you're probably going to be able to see an elf sorcerer and have a good idea how much health they have. So very consistent numbers from that perspective. Very customizable classes that's constantly expanding. It's almost impossible to keep up with it. But that's the strength of their system. The players are the majority, right? The number of game masters to players out there is usually a 6 to 8 to 1 ratio or more. If you're going to grow your game, feed the game masters and feed the players, and that's what they've been doing. They're creating more adventures, more places to go, more things to do, more classes to play, and with that comes, lots of feats. So choices are class centric. Some of them are ancestry oriented, which is like races, like I said before. Skills are tied to ability scores. They have an archetype feat system, which is a really interesting approach to multi-classing. Without going into too much detail, for example, in the original D&D, you're like 4 levels in Thief, and then you decide to spend your next level, leveling up Magic User, right? Where in this situation, you're going to, instead of choosing a class feat, say you hit level 4 or something, you pick a archetype feat from another class. Like say you're playing a cleric and you pick up an archetype feat in thievery or something like that, or a rogue subclass. Then you start unlocking feats for that kind of a subclass in a way, and it's called an archetype. That's a really interesting system. It's pretty well balanced, that's for sure. It's not a true multi-class system like you think, but it does give you the ability to dabble in abilities from other classes without changing what your main class is. So you aren't giving up one class to dabble in some abilities in the other. They introduced a thing called Proficiency Bonus in 3.0 and 3.5. It was always base attack bonus, right? Every class was clustered into groups. Like a ranger might have a base attack bonus of 22 at level 12 or something like that, versus a rogue might only have a base attack bonus of 17 or something. And so they've removed that kind of class-centric predetermined roll to hit bonus, which inherently created a hierarchy of like who's better at hitting targets versus who better at defending them. Instead, they introduced this proficiency bonus, which is based upon your level plus whatever your expertise is in particular types of combat. So that's really, really nice, paired with your core ability score, like you're using melee weapons, is mostly strength, and ranged weapons are going to use dexterity. That equalizes the amount of the chances for people to hit. Proficiency bonus is also taken into effect when you cast spells. You're having to hit when you cast spells now. You're not just dropping something down on the ground unless it's area effect and having it hit everyone. You're having to actually roll to hit something. So that makes it more fun for spellcasters. And because of that system, there's ranks of these proficiencies. So there's an untrained, trained, expert, master, and legendary. And you gain these different levels of proficiency and gain incrementally duplicating bonuses of +2, 4, 6, and 8 based on which level range you are. So instead of having like a base attack bonus number that just keeps going 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, you have the situation where you gain 4 or 5 levels, and now you gain another rank in something that you chose to rank up, right? Because you made a choice when you leveled up, and you decided to get to a master level in this. So you'll be really, really good at using a flail, or really, really good at using this other ability. So, and as I mentioned earlier, there's an extensive series of traits for actions, even just the types of weapons you can use. Weapons will have multiple traits to them that allow you to trip people, that allow you to puncture armor a certain way, allow you to bleed people, do different types of damages. That's really, really powerful. Just having a weapon in your hand in of itself can open up ways to use the weapon besides just I attack. So you may want to specifically say that you're going to do something very creative with the weapon, and it can have a gameplay effect. That's something that no other version of the game has really embraced or ever done. I found it to be really, really useful. They're called weapon traits. Like, for example, you might have a weapon trait. Let's see here. Let me pull one up. I got the book in front of me here. Read one to you real quick. Like an agile. In the game, when you attack something, it has you have a 3-action economy. If you run up to something, you can attack 3 times. Everyone in the game gets to do that. 3 actions, right? Some things take 2 action points to do. Some things take 1. Moving takes 1. So I can move, say I have 25-foot base movement speed, they call it. In my round, my turn at the table, I could run 25, 25, 25. I can put 75 feet between me and an enemy if I want to. Now, he could do the same thing when it's his turn. If he runs faster than me, he might catch up to me. If he runs slower, I can kite him, right? But with weapon traits, you have a thing called, when you're in melee combat, you have a thing called multiple attack penalty, or MAP. So if I attack something, the same target, repeatedly, the second and third attack have a lower chance to hit. And so that multiple attack penalty is -5 on the second swing because the enemy's getting better at defending what you're presenting as attacks, and it's -10 on that third one. So it's really hard to hit something on the third attack for sure, but not so hard on the second if you're pretty powerful, unless you're attacking a really strong enemy. So if you have a weapon with the agile trait on it, that penalty goes to -4 and -8. So you ask yourself, like, well, what would be like a light mace or a dagger? It has an agile trait. So when you make your choices about what kind of weapon you want to use, if you're playing a rogue and you want to make sure you're healing something pretty quickly, you're only going to have -8 to hit on your third swing. So if you run up there and start melee DPS and the devil out of something, that's a lot different than having that -5 and -10. And those are pretty big. Those are pretty big modifiers to combat. So just an example of just that system, there is an extensive conditions. Conditions are good and bad, in my opinion. If you ever played Guild Wars 2, they have a really amazing condition system where they stack bleeding and burning and all this kind of stuff, and chilled. They have a lot of conditions in Pathfinder Second Edition. They can bog the game down tremendously. If you have a GM that knows how they work and is very good at apply them, it makes the game really interesting. They're basically like debuffs more than anything else. You could be doomed or poisoned and things like that. Moved slow, stunned, stupefied, restrained, quickened. It can be very tricky because they're all kind of like adjectives. They're like a state of what's happened to your character, which makes sense. If you're stupefied, what can I do? And there's rules for that. And if the GM is really, really good at understanding that, there's even little cards you can get that you can put the card on your character at the table. Says, listen, you've been stunned. You're stunned for the next turn. You can't do any actions. You can't move. You get a chance to resist it and roll to get out of it. Things like that. There's a lot of interesting conditions in the game that you can do to add a lot of actual effects. And the good thing is that most people see the conditions. They go, well, this is going to suck for me. I'm going to end up being stunned and doomed and everything else that's going to happen to me. Well, you can do it to enemies. I mean, you could do these same things to, just the good old fashioned being flat-footed and hidden is, you could do the same thing. You could, paralyzing and petrifying and knocking somebody prone and tripping people. And I mean, those kinds of things are really useful. It does get into the weeds a little bit when you get into this whole detected and unnoticed and observed type of states, which I find to be probably the weakest thing in the whole game. The way that stealth is handled, I actually don't like it. I use house rules for that, but it's there and it's very well worked out. But you have to watch a whole basic for gamers how it played video to figure out how to do it because it's very confusing. But it's there and it's well worked out. And so the condition system in the game is very extensive. And as I mentioned before, the game has a 3-action economy with high mobility. So now start to imagine this in your mind. You've got a character that has so many options of things you could do based upon what your choices are when you created the character. Then you have this 3-action economy. Then you have all these traits and these feats and these actions you can do. When it's your turn, you might be like, I'm going to try this time. You're going to have so many options. It's you have more options than all the pieces on a chessboard. It's just crazy how many things you could possibly do, and there's rules for every single one of them, and the enemies have that many options too. So that makes it very, very tricky. Any fight played twice the same way, twice won't be the same way, excuse me. If you have a fight, you could just do a little fight right now, roll up a level 5 fighter on the app, roll up, get a couple orc brutes in there and have them disarm you, and you'd be like, wow, this is tough. So you're going to need to think about where you stand, what you do, how do you want to take someone out, how you want to focus fire someone. You're going to have to really kind of think like a raider, a hardcore EverQuest raider, to tell you the truth. So not a WoW raider, but a EverQuest raider. For some people, it's really compelling and fun. If it's not for you, then hopefully your game master kind of tones it down and keeps it more goofy and fun. It's still, the options are there. You can take the complexity as far as you want to. So the next thing we're going to go over here is this whole Fortitude Reflex will saves. Those are just lifted right from 3.5. They're pretty much the same. The melee round 6 seconds. It's been that way since 3rd edition. It's no longer a 1 minute melee round anymore. Everyone using that. D&D uses a 6-second melee round. There are a lot of rules that can get complex and confusing fast. If you let it, you don't have to use those rules. Keep the game moving fast and you'll be fine. Nothing worse than bogging the fun factor of the game down by having a rules looking up session. I do want to touch these last 4 slides about what you can play in a game. You've heard me mention the phrase ancestry. Obviously, you know what classes are, but you have 2 main books that have the options for the base 12 classes, which are in blue on the left-hand side here, of the Alchemist, Barbarian, Bard, Champion, Cleric, Druid, Fighter, Monk, Ranger, Rogue, Sorcerer, and Wizard. All of them are very different. All of them have very interesting mechanics associated with them. They have a lot of specific feats they can do. A bard with a weapon in their hand can do so many different things than a champion, which is in essence a paladin, versus a barbarian versus a fighter. They just don't do the same things. It isn't like I attack with my 2-handed sword. It's just completely different, the things you can do. So every single class is very unique, have very strong themes associated with what they can do that you would expect. They all have key ability scores and secondary ability scores. But the interesting thing is, unlike in AD&D, these classes are no longer restricted by what race they play, so which they're calling ancestries in the modern world. So dwarf, elf, gnome, goblin, halfling, and human, you could play any of these, and each of these has going to have ability scores that they favor, such as the elf favors dexterity and intelligence, but their constitution is a flaw. So when you're rolling that character up, you are going to have a little bit, your constitution will be lower. Now, you're going to get a lot of free ability boosts along the way, so you may not end up with an elf with 18 constitution, but you could probably finagle it with 16 if you work it right. But you may find that your particular class you're playing, for example, let's say you're playing a rogue, an elf rogue, and the dexterity bonus is going to be fantastic for you. The intelligence bonus might affect which skills you choose. Your constitution might be a little lower, but you might be like, well, that's fine with me because I really want the movement because the elf has a really high movement rate. So on the right-hand side, we see these inner sea region ancestries of this catfolk, kobold, orc, ratfolk, and tengu. These are all lifted from mythology and things like that. So, it almost reminds me of some of the EverQuest 2 character races, to tell you the truth. The catfolk and the kobold and the orc and the ratfolk, they almost feel completely lifted from EverQuest 2, but that's okay. And then they add these really interesting classes, the investigator, oracle, swashbuckler, and witch. Those were in Pathfinder 1. These are not new. So this isn't like the first time someone just randomly made up a new class in 2 years and vomited it into the game. So that's really well done. That's an advanced player's guide. Lots of cool options there. Lastly, here we got character sheets, right? Every one of these games is going to have character sheets. You can fill it out by hand. The ones that have the the ugly terracotta brown and blue in the background are the default ones. There's 4 pages. You can get those in black and white, of course. The Paizo sheet's just not form fillable. That's really disappointing. You can purchase color ones that are class specific. Not really necessary, to tell you the truth. But there is a user in the community named Datalore who took the time to create a form fillable version of it, who also recalculated and redesigned the sheet. And it's the one you see over here on the right hand side, I believe. This one over here, you see here, right here I've got highlighted. He made it really, really nice, or she made a really nice form fillable page. It'll calculate everything for you as you're filling it out. So, put your core ability score in there, build the character, and it's going to fill it out for you. That's really nice. It still requires some thinking. You still need to know what you're doing, but it's going to be a lot better than just looking at a blank one and not knowing where to put numbers. I can't say enough how powerful Path Builder 2e is. You open up a character, create a new character, and when you're done, you export to PDF. And this character sheet is an example of a character I built in like 2 minutes. So I knew what I wanted to do. This wacky sorcerer from our classic DM show that we did last year, we played the game and made these really bizarre sorcerer builds, level 5 sorcerers. This was a spear-wielding melee sorcerer, if you can believe it, that does a lot of debuffs and intimidation. And it sounds crazy, right? Completely viable class. So that was built in Path Builder in like 2 minutes. It allowed me to use the Advanced Player's Guide, which I didn't have. It allowed me to pick options from the Lost Omens Character Guide, which I didn't have at that time. So that's really, 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 really useful. And lastly, if you're thinking about getting into the game, just like if you played D&D in the past, you need to think about the character icons and themes. As I mentioned before, the thing they've done really well is they have these signature characters all over the place. So when they're talking about a druid, they're always going to have this character on the screen. They're going to talk about, the sorcerer. She's always going to be this one. This is the cleric. This is the little alchemist guy. And this is the witch character. You're going to see them in all the artwork everywhere. So if you want to get an idea of what some of these characters are doing, you'll know right away from their icons. The world themes are just really interesting. Their whole world is very exotic. It has a lot of real world history vibe to some of the regions. A lot of massive, powerful, crazy storyline elements. A lot of villainous behind the scenes, pulling the puppet strings type of storylines. A lot of characters, a lot of NPCs. Very epic. Their game worlds are adventure paths are extremely epic, and a lot of exotic locations that will really test your skills. A lot of combat too. And lastly, with any of these kinds of games, you're always going to have this kind of a cool theme. Their signature artwork pieces, just like these here, are just the kind of memories you'll have forever. That one time you're surrounded by 2 mummies, or that one time you're being attacked at sea by this multi-headed serpent on your stupid rowboat. Those kinds of moments are just absolutely hilarious, and that's the magic of the entire game. So what we'll do in a later video is we'll actually go through a rundown of the character creation process, which is these page-by-page slides here. We'll go through all these details to walk you through how to build your character from scratch, where to look out for things, where to find things, where the hard decision-making get, all the way till you get to the end, making your own character, and then going back and double-checking things with the app. But that's it for this really long introductory video. Hope it's been useful for you. It's about an hour long. I'll chapter this up so you can switch to different sections pretty quickly. And hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave a comment below. We'll talk to you later.